Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar video. This one is going to be my, I suppose, preview ahead of Imbalance Part 1 coming out. So obviously we know the book is coming out on December 18th. The interesting thing about that release date though is that December 18th is actually a Tuesday. The book is actually out December 19th in comic book stores, but the actual mass market release date is actually before that. I don't know if this is something that they're necessarily changing to make it so that these books they basically are out on the same day everywhere. What it means though is that for this book, it's going to be available online actually before comic book stores. So pretty much like midnight 17th going into 18th, we're going to have this book available. So that's something interesting with this book, is that it is going to be super readily available for everyone, because the digital release is going to be the initial release, which we haven't had in a while, but that should actually, I think, get people more interested in this book, because it is the return of Avatar comics after like a year and a half, like getting close to, I suppose, 2 years since the last one, the end of North and South. We've got a new creative team on the book. Faith Erin Hicks is writing it and Peter Wortman is doing the art. And then I'll quickly read out the product description, because obviously this came out ages ago, but I think it's nice to always go back to it just before the book comes out. So the description, the official description for this book, the thing that's going to be on the back basically. When Team Avatar returns to Earth and Fire Industries, the factory owned by Toph's father, they find that the once small town is now booming, yet a strange mood hangs over its residents. When Aang is asked to join a business council meeting, the reason becomes clear. A massive Bender versus non-Bender conflict is threatening to turn violent. And that's what we know. Now, we've obviously had, I think, 17 preview pages. We've seen the first 11 pages of the book, and then we've seen 6 pages from around 50 to 56, in or around that. So we have an idea about what the book is about, but obviously we haven't yet seen the important scenes. So the important scenes, based off the description, is obviously what the problem is, what really causes the Bender non-Bender issue. Now obviously the thing surrounding this book, what the, I suppose, hype is going into it, is that this is very much proto-Republic City. We know from basically the second page of this book that they arrive and they basically see the exact same shot that is like the opening of Korra, and it's, you know, 60% of what Republic City is in terms of how big it is. Obviously it's a much more early in terms of like the kind of quality of the buildings and stuff like that. It's this town that has just grown incredibly quickly, and a lot of problems have come along with that. And the interesting thing about this is that this is a direct continuation of the Rift. So if there's any work to be done before you check out Imbalance, I definitely recommend that you guys go and reread the Rift, because that's the introduction of the Earth and Fire refineries. That's obviously the Toph and her father book, so that dynamic, you'll be refreshed on that. The whole idea of the town now being called Cranefish Town, that's actually kind of explained in the first couple of pages of Imbalance, but it also makes sense with the Rift, with Lady Tianhai and the Cranefish being the animal that sort of represented her in the end. So that's like somewhat significant. But Bender non-Bender conflict looks to be the main plot of this book, which, you know, makes sense. That ends up being the first major conflict that Korra encounters when she goes to Republic City for the first time. And I suppose that is both the positive and potentially the negative of this book. That, is there going to be more to this book than just setting up basically the first episode of Korra to a degree? And that's a bit of a weird way of putting it, but that's what the first episode of Korra does. She goes to the city and encounters these set problems. There is, you know, there's homeless people, poor people. There's Bender, non-Bender issues, primarily caused by the triads, the bending triads, the bending gangs, and those type of things. She encounters like a variety of different issues. You know, she has some problems with the police. And it seems like that's what this book is trying to do. Set up where a lot of that stuff actually comes from. Now, obviously a lot of that stuff sort of in place in terms of like we know Toph eventually becomes chief of police, and it would sort of make sense that the reason she suddenly gets that position is because her father is an essential like founding member effectively of what becomes Republic City. So she's already in a sort of high position in terms of being somehow involved in one of the main factories, and then she has a metal bending school, and we know that the police eventually becomes metal bending police force. So it sort of makes sense, and I'm kind of wondering, will the book on Toph's side of things address that? On the Toph front as well, I wonder, will Satoru come back? Because the last thing we got from Satoru, again, reread the Rift, guys, we're going into this one. Satoru was talking to the cabbage merchant about basically forklifts. Basically, I think cabbage merchant having the idea of making a technology company, Cabbage Corp as we know. Will we see Cabbage Corp? Because they specifically mention it in the preview pages for Imbalance that loads of factories have sprung up. They mention in the description that I just read a business meeting, and that's the big thing that the preview is leading towards, that they arrive, it's not a great reception, but Toph's father immediately asks Aang especially, but the whole team basically, to attend this business meeting of the main leaders of the town. So that's going to be, I think, where everything kind of kicks off, and we'll really begin to see what the core of the issue is. As for the Bender non-Bender issue, it's been gradually set up, I think, over the last couple of comics. I do think the Rift has been the first one to touch on it, because obviously the Earth and Fire Refinery had the bending line, and it also had the non-bender line, and the idea was that technology allowed the non-benders to be basically just as effective as the bender line. Or I think they specified that like it's close, like the bender line is still slightly more efficient, but the technology is advancing and it's getting the non-bender line to that point. So is that maybe what's happening here? Maybe the benders are losing kind of jobs because the technology is outpacing them, or what? And that's going to be an interesting one to see, because at the very end of the preview we see that the first sense of an issue of benders starts to come in, of this earthbender kind of gang group basically, and a firebender group. Basically look like they're about to have a bending fight just over a minor issue in the middle of the streets. And who's going to suffer for that? Of course, probably non-benders. So that's basically proto-triads of just like groups of benders kind of you know, throwing their weight around, throwing their power around, and that's going to cause a bit of an issue. The reason I say it's also potentially like the weakness of the book, in that like it would seem like, oh cool, that's great, this book is going to feature tons of connective tissue of how ATLA gets from now to, like, you know, 60 something years later, having all of this stuff be in place for Korra. How does this all come about basically? And that's cool, but like if that's all the book is, I think the biggest question that I think a lot of people have, anyone who's skeptical about this book have, is can it tackle any of the issues that Korra eventually faces well enough that like it doesn't just feel like it's setting up a bigger issue for later on? Will there actually be an issue presently in that case? And I think the main fear that I have for this book is that it will go the way North and South ended up going. It will go the way that Turf Wars was throughout the full thing, of just not really having anything to discuss by the end of it. It's either very self-explanatory and there's nothing really to discuss, it's just, it's fine, it's a perfectly fine read, art is good, you know, but there's nothing to discuss because it just is self-explanatory, it just explains itself. Or in Turf Wars' case, there's just not a lot there in the first place. And that's where my worry is, of like, what are the big character arcs that we're going to be dealing with here? What development are we trying to get towards? Because we're not going to get Republic City just yet. It seems very, very early to like really move towards like directly beginning to call it Republic City, mentioning the idea of United Republic and making it official. It still feels like we're in the early stages of like it becoming and gathering all of those features, and then in a couple of years that's when the decision needs to be made to basically make it a nation to itself. Because they mention here that at the start it doesn't have a government. That might be part of what they start to form here, but I think there's still the case of it still feels probably like it's mainly Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom people here. And the South obviously is beginning to come to play. Again, the Rift featured Katara and Sokka's kind of friends from the South who had come to work there. And then in North and South, the one link into that bigger like world advancing plot was that Hakoda wanted to build like a harbor to connect, like in terms of like shipping and stuff like that, the South to the rest of the world more readily. So that clears the path for Water Tribe to become involved in Republic City, but it seems a little early just yet before we get to it basically being a nation of the three nations. The other factor we probably need to get is that for it to officially become Republic City, you have to have Air Temple Island be what it is, so it is a nation of all nations. And that might be something that ends up coming out of Imbalance, that Aang realizes that this is a town he needs to be there to watch and monitor as it grows. This is going to be the cause of, I suppose, any like issues that come up of late. And I think he probably realizes that he needs to have a home, a base of operations. He, obviously with the air temples kind of abandoned, like they can obviously come up with the idea of beginning to use them again, but Aang needs a central location here, and I think this is where they probably need to start the idea of maybe transitioning the team away from the constant traveling that's been the case since the start of ATLA, to actually like know this group, if they're going to be helping Aang for the whole time, they need to be right here next to Cranefish. Maybe not in the city, but the island seems like the perfect place to do all of this. And I think this is where, like, I think what they need to do with the characters is this. One, Sokka needs development. I think this is your opportunity, because I think a lot of people are going to really lose confidence in the book's tackling Sokka well, if you don't have him do anything of note here. He's been a little bit too comedic and only used for comedic effect in basically all of the books up to now. He's had his moments. There's a very nice emotional moment with Toph and Sokka in The Promise, where he helps her, the whole, you know, Toph talking about pressure and her teaching, and it helped her, I think it did, and that was fine. You know, he had a little bit of a serious moment in the search with the fact that he basically fought Azula, like, on top of, like, Nora and Noriko's house for a good while and didn't get himself killed. Like, he held Azula off for a good while, and that was kind of impressive, even though no one really noted it. And there's been little moments like that throughout. North and South was probably the most disappointing portrayal of Sokka, where they roughly tried to do something where Melina placed him in a leadership role, kind of, but we never really saw what came of that. That's what they need to do. They need to build Sokka up into the leader that he eventually becomes. Right now, I don't get the feeling that, like, Sokka feels like the obvious choice for the next Chief of the South. In terms of, like, it makes sense because, like, in a way, like, who else is it going to be? But he doesn't feel ready just yet, at least in his portrayal in the comics. Similarly, it doesn't feel like he's that knowledgeable about what's going on, where it would, like, justify if the council actually forms, the Republic City Council forms earlier than expected, that Sokka would be the obvious one chosen. I get that's probably not going to happen for a good few years yet, if Republic City being made official. But you have to move Sokka to get to that point. Similarly, the first couple of pages of the preview tease the fact that they discover what's going on in Cranefish, and Toph asks them to stop by there, on their way to go see Suki in Yu Dao. Yu Dao, obviously from The Promise, the very first comic, the first hint of, like, the colonies, the aftermath of the war, and the fact that this is the state of the world at this point in time. The nations are going to merge. It's not something that needs to be stopped, as Roku would perhaps have done in the past. This is something that needs to be accepted. So that's a cool little reference. But are you moving Suki away from being Zuko's bodyguard? I think that's what you need to do. Because if you need Zuko to have a high-end warrior as his bodyguard, you have Ty Lee. Ty Lee is from the Fire Nation. She's a Kyoshi warrior. That's the perfect role for her. If Zuko and Mei are going to get back together, as I suspect they will, basically next time we see them, it makes perfect sense that Mei's best friend, basically, would be the main bodyguard there. And that's a perfect role for, basically, Suki to kind of step away and Ty Lee to take on this kind of important role for the Kyoshi Warriors. But it allows Suki to, travel more with Sokka, go back home if she needs to do. Allow her to just be part of Team Avatar like she is. And it's so often forgotten that she is a member of Team Avatar. And we need to know stuff about her as well. So I hope, for the sake of this book, Suki is an actual part of the book and isn't just we'll end Imbalance and they'll just be like, oh, we're going off to see Suki. And potentially the next book isn't even about Suki. I hope it's not just a vague kind of plot thing of like, oh, we randomly discovered this on the way to see Suki, but we never see her. You need to, I think, introduce her into this book. Like, I do everything possible in this book to make sure that word gets out to Suki that, like, we need you here to be involved in what's going on. I think that's it's one way to make the book a little bit more interesting if all you have is set up towards Republic City. If you don't really have an arc for certain characters and so on, that's what you need to do. I think there's been one early review for the book. It's not a very good review because there's no depth to it whatsoever. The one thing it seemed to mention was that Katara doesn't necessarily play a huge role in the book, which I think is fine coming off North and South, where she was basically the focus character. I think other characters need to kind of have a chance to shine. Aang is obviously the kind of leader of the group. Of course, he's going to get a focus. Toph is kind of personally involved in this. It would make sense why she would come to the forefront. And Sokka, we don't know if he plays a role, but it would make sense as the non-bender member of the group that this topic would at least affect him in some way. He would be invested in it to a degree. The interesting thing about it, though, is that the preview pages from later on in the book that we have from around the 50s, so like with only about 20 pages to go, Sokka, it seems like at that point in the book, they've seen the bender-non-bender issue. They know that there's a problem there. But the way Aang and Sokka talk about it, it doesn't really feel like Sokka is like been changed or overly affected by it. It's just like, oh hey, that's more or less our first time really seeing kind of backlash against benders. What's that about? And the Sokka's just like, yeah, it's fine. So are they going to move him into a position, or is he just not going to be a focus again? That's what I'm a little kind of concerned about, exactly what the plot is. I think that's the one thing I still am unsure about with this book. Depending on how they do the issue, the non-bender issue, I think it's going to be the real turning point of this book. If it is just this like vague thing of like, oh, the benders are fighting and like it affects us, and it's basically just the exact same point from Korra, but told at this point, that's not massively interesting when the comics could be doing so much else. The main thing that I always have in my mind with the comics is the plot point, the big plot point in the background that's being set up, Azula. In the Search it was set up, it was continued in Smoke and Shadow ended with basically saying Azula is going to terrorize the Fire Nation until basically she forms Zuko by her act into the Fire Lord that she feels is needed. Why don't we get back to that plot point? That's a big one, and if Imbalance fails to deliver, there'll always be the sense of, why didn't you just tell that story when it was set up directly for you? So there's that. As for, I suppose, like Aang, like, he's going to be a focus. We've already seen right now they're doing the whole thing of like basically everyone he meets, he's doing the airbender marble trick, and Obviously, it tends to impress a lot of people, but it's not necessarily impressing the people of this town, except for the two Bender boys that he meets later on. So they're kind of presenting that idea of like, okay, Benders are impressed by Aang because he's a Bender. Why aren't non-Benders impressed by Aang? Is it just because he's a Bender, or what? Is there a sense that he's maybe only helping out non-Benders? I find that a kind of difficult point to get, because Aang and the group saving the world has like just had a net benefit for everyone, full stop. Unless they're going to try and make some weird point about how the Fire Nation being in control would have actually brought prosperity to the world, but I think that's just a point that I don't think the show, any media related to the show, would want to make, apart from maybe some Fire Nation people, like they sort of were doing in like The Promise. I think they kind of did that. So, you know, there's that. Toph, like what are they necessarily going to do with Toph? The preview pages don't suggest that like she's too much of a focus, but there is a little bit of a sense in the early pages that like her father's kind of ignoring her. She has this title within the Earth and Fire Industries company, but he doesn't really seem to like include her necessarily as an important part of the organization. He's immediately like, I want Aang involved in this, even though Toph is like an executive partner or whatever. So I'm wondering, will they address that again, and like Toph like feel the need to like really step in and do something, make decisions on her own, confront her father about what's happening again. I'd like her to like ask like what's up with her mother, because they left that like as an open thing, that like their mother is still like kind of gone, like she left the father. Like now that Toph and her father have a better relationship, will their mother, Poppy Beifong, come back into play? I'm not sure. It'd be something I'd like them to address, just in terms of a little bit of a more emotional arc, that potentially Lau is too focused on what's going on here, and he sort of ignored Toph a little bit, and especially ignored Poppy, when clearly it should be time for like a family reunion type thing. If indeed she's taking a step away from like the business side of things, or she's not involved in it, I can maybe see some sort of a sense of her maybe being the one to, seeing all this kind of craziness going on, decide that like something might happen in this comic where like she is forced into a decision where she just realizes that actually I want to be the one to stop this. I want to stop this crime happening, and you know, get involved in this. And the idea of her becoming like chief of police or like head of security happens at some point, and she's placed into that role. Maybe it's a little too early, it's a little on the nose, given that she becomes chief of police later, but you have to set it up somehow that it happens. And I think that involves probably transitioning like either the school into becoming basically like the Academy for Metalbender Police Force, or her basically handing the dojo over to her first 3 metalbending students, and her taking on the role of like, I'll start a police force or something like that. Again, given that her father is a pretty big player on the council, and kind of in a way has been the one to help form this massive city around like his company. Which is interesting. In like Turf Wars, we basically know that the Earth and Fire Refinery is this like abandoned factory. So like the center point of this like this city, this nation of nations, ends up actually sort of going out of business, as I suppose Cabbage Corp comes in and, you know, is a big thing. You know, Future Industries comes in. That's another big thing. And that's why I'm saying like, I'd like to see Satoru at some point, because you probably have to address like, is there a relationship between Satoru and Toph? Because they were sort of teasing that she likes him, he likes her. They never really committed to any sort of romantic thing. And given that it's still up in the air as to who Su Yin's father is, Satoru, it doesn't make sense. Maybe not, but if you want to set up the idea that like Toph ends up having just like a kind of odd romantic kind of life as things go on, it'd be interesting to have her kind of have this relationship, and maybe it doesn't work out. And you know, if you're telling her story show just that it doesn't end up working out for her kind of romantically over her life. Katara, if indeed she, as one of the reviews suggest, she doesn't play a big role, as I said, it's fine. Once they sort of mention that, like, she was the one to bring up the idea of, like, a nation of nation in the first place when it comes to Yu Dao, I'd like to see that sort of connection be made. And then once they continue with her in the kind of, I think, role that she has been in, of, like, she's been there to kind of support Aang in the leadership role that he's kind of playing, in that, like, Aang got a chance to sort of support her a little bit towards the end of North and South. This would be a nice chance to sort of return the favor here again, like she has in some of the earlier comics. So that's, I think, fine. So yeah, I think that's most of what I want to talk about here. Again, not really knowing the details around the specifics with the non-bender issue, the bender non-bender issue. It's kind of hard to get into a lot of details. So I'll just end with, once again, where I'm at with this is that I'm excited for it because it is the return of Avatar comics after a year and a half, kind of going on 2 years. But I also don't think it's necessarily fair to kind of give the book a little bit of a get-out-of-jail-free card just because it is the return of the Avatar comics. I think we still have to treat these with the same level of quality and review them fairly and evenly. In that, sure, it'll be exciting to have another Avatar comic, but if it fails to deliver, if it doesn't live up to expectations, and for me, where I'm at with the comics is that, to me, the first 4 comics, the Promise, the Search, the Rift, and Smoke and Shadow, are the ones to aim for. Turf Wars is right down the bottom, and then North and South is kind of somewhere in the middle, where, like, half of it's quite good, the other half of it isn't so great. So Imbalance needs to be aiming for the top and not kind of aiming to be on par with North and South. I don't think it will be difficult to beat the quality that was Turf Wars, so I'm not worried about that at all. But I am worried that this will not be the substantial, notable stories that we're looking for. I'm worried that, once again, this is going to be like the 4th or 5th Avatar comic in a row that will come out, and there won't be a lot of discussion to be had, because it doesn't really look like it's telling anything overly interesting. Because again, if you've been in the fandom for a while, remember the reaction when, like, The Search Part 1 came out. Yes, it ended up being a kind of like bit of false information, the whole Ikem is Zuko's father. But it got people talking because we didn't at that point know Ursa's full backstory. And her backstory being revealed was a surprise with how in-depth they went in on it, with, like, insight into Ozai and what he was like, the whole Azulon stuff, setting up the 2 family lineages together. That was really cool, and then plus the Mother of Faces thing, what actually happened, and I suppose the more present day. It was surprising, shocking, and it got people talking. Same with The Promise. Like, say what you will about, like, why would Aang ever agree to like kill Zuko? Like, I think that it made complete sense with the situation, how that happened. It got people talking because it was a little bit of a shocking moment. It was like, I get why Zuko would ask Aang to do that, and I get why Aang, after what they've been through, would agree to that. And it led to some great character development as we went on. And I'll admit, yeah, The Promise definitely had some, first comic, problems. But it hit some great moments. Like, again, the Sokka Toph emotional stuff towards the end. You actually had Suki arrive towards the end of that and reunite with Sokka. That was fun. And it led to a big kind of 3-way conflict between these 3 younger leaders of, like, Aang, Zuko, and King Kuwei, who's inexperienced because of what happened in Ba Sing Se. So that's really cool. Even the Rift, you had some amazing world building with the spirit stuff outside of Book 2 Spirits. The Rift is probably the most insight we've ever had into spirits, how they work, how they function, and it was really well done with the Lady Tianhai General Old Iron story, plus the whole Yang Chen subplot, linking into the fact that Aang had separated from Roku in The Promise. Excellent, excellent stuff. Like, big stuff is happening. Again, like, remember, Mei and Zuko broke up in The Promise. Like, lots of stuff happened in The Promise. Not a lot has happened in the more recent comics. Like, what's the best moments from North and South? It's Hakoda talking to Katara about his relationship with Melina, comparing it to her relationship with Aang, and then Aang arriving. That was a great moment. Hakoda in general was kind of really good just throughout the book. There was like a shocking moment where like Gilak stabbed Hakoda, but because he ended up just being crazy, you know, a lot of the Gilak stuff doesn't have a lot of kind of, you know, meaning to it all that much. The moment at the end at like Katara at Kaya's grave, that was kind of good, but again, they were fairly self-explanatory moments. In terms of like the bigger plots, like there's a reason people want Azula. They want Azula to come back because look, how impressive was it when in The Search, it wasn't only Ursa's backstory, where Ursa actually is at this point in time, but also the return of Azula and setting up an arc for her. Then Smoke and Shadow comes around and they're beginning to get Mei and Zuko back together. Ty Lee is a little bit of a focus in that book. Then Azula comes back into things in part 3, and we get, to me, one of the most impactful and discussion-worthy moments we've had in Avatar for a long time of what happened with between Zuko and Azula in the crypt in the first Fire Lord's advisor's grave or crypt. And just the change in kind of goal for Azula. Amazing, amazing. And that's why so many people want to return to that. And it's moments like that. Is there going to be any moments like that from this comic? Because Turf Wars just didn't have any. Like, you can discuss Korrasami all you want, but it's like, they didn't really go in depth into the relationship like I think some people wanted to. It was nice that if you were a fan of Korrasami, you probably got a lot out of it, but fundamentally it was just some cute moments. And we've had that with like Katang in the comics, but we've also had more meaningful relationship moments between them as well. In terms of plot and stuff like that, there was nothing to discuss with Turf Wars. In the end, with the plot, there was not a lot to discuss with North and South. So it has been, you know, 2 going on 3 years since we've really had, I think, a notable thing happen in terms of story content. And again, my fear with Imbalance is that that's what will happen again. That Imbalance will come and go, and all we'll have is this like slightly extra insight into how Republic City becomes the way it is, because we see it here. And there's no real character development for any of our characters, like Sokka becoming a leader, and, you know, the stuff that we want to see. And in terms of a greater sense of the comics, like obviously I've been critical of the fact that there's been no roadmap. They feel a little bit directionless in terms of like, what's the aim? Like in 5 years' time, is there a plan for where they want the comics to be? It feels like they're just kind of really making them up as they go along. And I get that's basically what happens with stories. But is there any plan, any direction to where they're heading? Is there a plan for a bigger time skip at some point? Or is there a reason that they're sticking in this sort of year, this specific year that basically everything is taking place in? Is there a reason why we're still here and we're just skipping weeks and maybe a couple of months at a time, but not ever really just going, boom, here's the characters in their 20s, here's a story that happens at this point in time, go. Why are we so kind of stuck here? Korra comics seem to have immediately kind of addressed that issue of like, they got the obvious thing of Korrasami out of the way. Immediately, here's kind of one of the things fans wanted. Kuvira. The other thing Korra fans wanted, of course, was the return to the Fire Nation. That can still come whenever they need to, but Kuvira does make sense to be the next one, and that looks to be very impactful. And I'm just a little worried about the return of Avatar comics here. I'm still excited because I love new Avatar content, new Avatar story content. It has been a while. So in terms of content, what you can expect from me, I will have, I'll probably do an initial non-spoiler review as soon as I can. Then I'll have a more in-depth, spoiler full detailed review. We'll of course have the podcast review where we basically read through the book, go through it page by page and analyze it, and I'll probably have another discussion topic or two as well related to that. And again, if there's actually a lot to the book, like I hope there is, we could potentially have discussion topics on specific stuff coming out of the book. Like you've seen on my channel, like probably 2 or 3, since Smoke and Shadow Part 3 has come out, you've probably seen 2 or 3 separate Azula discussion videos because of how interesting to analyze that one scene is, because of how impactful it is and how mysterious Azula's plot is. So yeah, expect a lot of review content come the 18th, 19th of December. And then especially after that, we're getting into end of year content where I'll have my top 5 story moments of the year, and then we'll look ahead to 2019, what merchandise is coming out, what books, what content is coming out, that sort of stuff. But in terms of my thoughts going into Imbalance, now that we have all the preview stuff out of the way, that's where I'm feeling. I'm excited, but I have my expectations very much set at like average, slightly above average for this book. I'm not expecting it to be impactful in the way I want it to be. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are heading into Imbalance. How excited are you for what this book looks to be about? Do you agree with what I've said here? Disagree with it? Definitely, I want to have some discussions with you guys in the comments below. But yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.